As a lot of you will be aware, that we've been coordinating the Central Highlands Business Awards, so that's happening on Friday night. And we've certainly got some people here who are going to be well represented on the night, I think. So we've got the gala dinner on Friday night, and we're looking forward to the announcements of that, but also looking forward to celebrating what we provide in this region in the way of business and supporting the people who are here. So as an additional commitment to that Business Awards and assisting businesses in their development and training, we've been fortunate enough to be able to bring Michael here to this region for a very quick visit for the day. He's been in Australia presenting at a conference, and he's going to share with us today some of that extensive knowledge and experience in working with communities to build economic opportunity and potential. So there's more information on Michael's biography on the programs on your tables that you're able to read, but please join with us in welcoming him to Central Highlands.
Thank you very much for that. It's lovely to be here. By show of hands, how many people here are small business people? All right. And by show of hands, how many of you small business people have all of the capital you ever need or want? Okay, so I think we're on the same page here, because what we're going to talk about is not just in the abstract ways that local business can thrive, but what I have been increasingly interested in, and that's what this book is all about, Local Dollars, Local Cents, is how to tap local pockets of money and put that into the hands of small business. So hopefully many small business people will have some ideas about where to get some of this additional capital by the end of the 50 or so minutes that I want to chat with you today. The starting place for me is just some observations about your situation. So you are a mining community. You have been an agricultural community. And we actually know from around the world a lot of characteristics of mining communities. Now, I'm not saying all these characteristics are absolutely true here, but it's worth thinking about them. And one is that mining communities tend to have really good times and then some really bad times. So it's characterized by boom and bust. There are often a small number of companies that are involved in the town, so it's not a very diversified ownership base. Sometimes it's difficult for other businesses to get up and running when you have a few larger players sort of occupying the scene. And I think the dependency on the big resource industry sometimes is a damper on entrepreneurship. There's a sense of, oh, I'll just go to work in the mine rather than I will start my own local business here. And I think all of these things put together do create some social upheaval every now and then. Now, in my view, the boom and bust piece of this is especially important because during the boom period, you have this sort of fountain of resources. And I think that if you want to think ahead, 50, 100 years, think about the kind of community you're going to bequeath to your children and grandchildren. It's really important to think about what this community is going to look like as you move away from the mining industry where it started. What will that diversified community look like? And I think it's critical to tap into the surplus that you have now during the somewhat relative boom years to make sure that you invest in this diversification of business for the future. Now, I want to give an example of someone in the United States who I think exemplifies what to do right in this situation. And it's not a mining town, although it's close, but it's a chocolate town. And many of you have experienced Hershey's chocolate bars. Hershey's was started by, oops, I better not walk there. Take that. Hershey's was started by the guy on the left, Milton Hershey, who was a great entrepreneur. And he built his first factories in a town that ultimately bore his name, Hershey, Pennsylvania. There were thousands of workers there. And he took the initiative to build for those workers affordable housing, all kinds of civic infrastructure, parks, churches, a trolley line, department stores, theaters. He created a foundation. He created a boys' school. In fact, his boys' school is the principal shareholder of the Hershey Chocolate Company. And I think, you know, the result is that Hershey became a really thriving town. Now, chocolate is still happening in Hershey, but lots of other things are happening in Hershey, Pennsylvania, 50 years after Milton Hershey died. If I could generalize from this, I think there are two rules that Hershey followed and that a wise community development policy will follow that are around the themes of ownership and self-reliance. So rule number one for prosperity is to maximize the percentage of people involved in locally owned enterprise. And rule number two is maximize diversification of the local economy. Now, both are not really that true for this community right now. So there's a lot of distance that one needs to travel to get from here to there. What I would like to do is share some evidence about why these principles are so important for your well-being. And then we'll talk about some specific kinds of action steps that one can take to achieve these goals. So rule number one, maximizing local ownership of business. The reason why it matters is very simple. Local businesses spend more of their money locally, and that has a very high impact on the so-called economic multiplier. This slide here comes from a study that was done in British Columbia a few months ago, and it shows that $1 spent at an independent retailer or an independent restaurant in British Columbia tends to spend upwards of 45 cents of every dollar in the economy. If you spend that same dollar in a chain restaurant or a chain store, chain department store, for example, only about 18 cents stays in the local economy. So in other words, every dollar you spend at a locally owned business generates, roughly speaking, 2.5 times the jobs that a non-local dollar might generate, 2.5 times the income and wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. We're not talking about small degrees of difference. Now, there have been about 24 of these studies done around the world, and they all show pretty much the same thing, that for every dollar spent at a locally owned business, your community will get 2 to 4 times the economic development impact, and there's not a single study that has shown otherwise. Don't take my word for it. This comes from the Harvard Business Review in the summer of 2010. The headline says, more small firms means more jobs, and it's a regression analysis of several hundred metro areas in the United States, and shows that per capita job growth is correlated with the presence of small local business. And here's a more recent study done by our central monetary system, the Federal Reserve, which shows that local entrepreneurship communities are the ones that are most likely not only to thrive and have growth rates, but also are those that are most likely to eradicate poverty and lead to social equality. So we have a powerful amount of evidence that locally owned businesses are key to the long-term prosperity of an economy. The second principle is the importance of local self-reliance. Now, what I mean by local self-reliance is not that you in any sense unplug from the global economy. It's very important to have lots of connections to the global economy and lots of exports. But what is important is to embrace a strategy toward engaging with the global economy that leaves you in a position of strength. So, to be frank, I think you've experienced here that as coal prices go up and down, your economy goes up and down. And it will be a lot healthier for your economy over time if you have 50 or 100 major export items, so that if one commodity price varies, you still have stability from the other commodities. If you think about it, the most prosperous community is going to be a community that sells as much as it can locally and as much as it can globally. Local, global, that's the whole horizon of where business is trying to sell their stuff. And I think one of the mistakes of mainstream economic development is to suggest that if you just focus on the global side of the picture, the local side takes care of itself. And in point of fact, what we know is that the local side is critically important. And getting that right is critically important. And if you nurture hundreds of local businesses today, those businesses are naturally going to start reaching for regional, national, and global markets. Now, I want to give you an example of a community that followed this strategy and actually became fairly wealthy. And it's an interesting economic development strategy because it was led not by a government agency, but by a business, specifically a delicatessen called Zingerman's. Zingerman's exists in Ann Arbor, Michigan, college town. And they had a very successful run in the 1980s. And then they reached a point where they wanted to continue to grow, but they weren't sure whether they wanted to become a chain delicatessen and build other delis across the country. They decided against it for two reasons. One was quality control. They really valued the quality control of their existing business. And as Paul Saginaw, one of the founders of Zingerman, says, the last thing I want to do in my declining years is run around the country and see second-rate versions of myself. The second reason was the people, that what Zingerman's really loved, the Zingerman staff really loved, were their friends and neighbors who would come to the delicatessen all the time. So they decided on a different growth strategy. And rather than growing broad, they would grow deep. So they looked systematically at things coming into the deli and things coming out of the deli and built businesses around it. So for example, they serve sandwiches. Why not create a bakehouse? They serve coffee. We could create a coffee roasting company. We serve ice cream and cheese. We could create a creamery. We serve good food, generally at the deli. Why not create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse? We have great cakes. We could create a mail-order cake business. We have great customer service. We could train other businesses how to do customer service. So in all, Zingerman's is now 9 independently owned businesses. Each has an independent set of partners around it. They co-license the brand. And this network of businesses is responsible for 550 jobs in Ann Arbor and annual sales of over $40 million. And I think one of the interesting pieces of this strategy is that it defies a lot of the conventional wisdom in economic development. That is, economic development says you really should be developing clusters around your existing centers of strength. So, for example, your cluster development would be right now around mining. Well, they didn't have a cluster of strength around food. They created a food cluster from scratch. And frankly, any community that is dependent on one or two industries has to create new clusters of strength. Now, you can use the mining industry as a way of propelling the launch of some of these newer clusters. But these clusters need to be created, I think, at some level autonomously. Now, I want to talk briefly about the competitiveness of local businesses, because you may think, okay, yeah, great to hear that local businesses can deliver all these benefits, but the truth is we're in an era of globalization and local businesses can never compete against bigger businesses. So I wanted to share with you some statistics from the United States and from Canada that may give you a little sense of confidence that local businesses actually are doing very well in this period of globalization. So this chart here comes from data in the United States, and there's 4 bands here. Oh, I better not do that. Okay. The top band is self-employed companies. The next band down is small businesses with under 100 employees. Then we have medium-scale businesses, 100 to 500 employees, and then 500 plus employees at the bottom. The top 3 bands, I will tell you, are 99.9% locally owned. So the only non-locally owned businesses are in the bottom band of bigger businesses. Now, what's interesting about these data here is that if it were true that global companies were becoming more competitive vis-a-vis local companies, we should have seen jobs shift from the small business sector to the big business sector. And in fact, as you can see, there's been no shift whatsoever. This is from 1998 to 2008, and the only line that really has changed is the growth of home-based businesses. And there's been a little bit of shrinkage in medium-scale businesses as a result of that. What about profit rates? These are the most recent data from businesses in Canada, and it shows that the highest profit rates are with companies 10 to 20 employees. Roughly double the profit rates that one gets from publicly traded companies that most of you have your pension funds in right now. We have similar data in the United States, and I suspect if I had more time to dig in the data of Australia, I would find very similar results here. Now, given these preliminary comments, what does a local economic development strategy look like? In my mind, it's useful to organize a to-do list around 6 Ps. I give them all Ps to make them easy to remember. Planning, people, partners, purse, purchasing, and policy making. Planning means identifying all the leaks in your economy, identifying all the places where people in the community are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services, because those are opportunities for new business creation. People. How do we develop a new generation of entrepreneurs to lead these leaf-plugging businesses? Partners. How do we make networks of local business more competitive as a team than they would be operating alone? Purse. How do we harness pension funds locally? Purchasing. How do we spearhead buy local or think local first campaigns? And policy making. I have a really simple goal for public policy, which is just be absolutely neutral and don't favor any business. Now, I want to give you an example, one example of each of these to give you a sense of what this agenda would look like. So for planning, I did a study for Metro Cleveland 3 years ago with 2 other scholars, and we looked at what would be the impact if the metropolitan area of Cleveland moved 25% of the way from where it is now to self-sufficiency in food. And what we found was that a 25% shift would generate 27,000 new jobs, enough in principle to put 1 in 7 unemployed residents of this area back to work. It would generate about $1 billion in new wages, and it would increase state and local tax collections $125 million. We would also generate another $125 million because taking people off the unemployment rolls means fewer government welfare expenditures. These kinds of leakage analyses, I think, are very powerful in educating people about what the potential is of growing local business. People. One of the tools that I think is really powerful for growing local businesses is an incubator, a business incubator, but particularly when the business incubators are focused on specific sectors. So we're seeing in the United States, even in relatively small towns and counties, the growth of kitchen incubators to grow food businesses. One could imagine nonprofit social enterprise incubators, service business incubators, small-scale manufacturing incubators. Partners. Tucson Originals is a group of local food businesses in Tucson, Arizona. They've been around for about 15 years. And they collectively buy foodstuffs, kitchen equipment, and dishes, and thereby bring down their costs and make themselves more competitive vis-a-vis non-locally owned food businesses. Purchasing. All around the world, one can see examples of buy local campaigns. You know, you see examples of buy local campaigns here. Most of these campaigns cost money in order to educate people about local business. I want to give you 2 examples of buy local campaigns that make money. So, Supportland is a loyalty card in Portland, Oregon, carried by several thousand residents of Portland. And every time they use that card at a local business, they generate loyalty points that translate into discounts at the next round of purchases they make at other local businesses. This framework makes money. Bernal Bucks is a local debit card issued by a local credit union, in Bernal Heights, a neighborhood of San Francisco. Now, like most debit cards, every time someone uses the debit card, a small percentage goes back to the financial institution as a fee. In this case, the credit union very wisely decided, we're going to give that fee to the local business association, and so that they will then use that money to educate people how and where to use that debit card to support local business in the most effective way. Policy making. There's a lot of things we could talk about with public policy making. Here's one that I think is just an easy one to think about, which is how can one get the local government to buy more local more of the time? I work with a lot of public policy makers in the United States and Canada. Everyone is afraid that if you have too much of a local preference, you will run against national procurement laws and treaty laws. But there are ways of doing this. For example, if you take into account the local impacts of a company that spends more of the contract locally, it will automatically translate into a preference that's rooted in the objective benefits the community will get from contracting locally. So you probably noticed here that I skipped one. I skipped purse, because purse, I think, is the big challenge. All of these other things are important, but I believe that all around the world, the single biggest obstacle to growing local businesses is capital. And unfortunately, the problem of capitalization has a lot to do with you. Which brings me to this nice photo here. So I want to do a little survey here. We've already established a couple of things. We've established that this audience is mostly local small business people. I've shown you data from the United States about that our non-local business sector is about 45% of the economy. If I showed you a breakdown of your economy, you would find that 3/4 of the Australian economy is small and medium and local. 3/4. The profit rates of these businesses are strong. These businesses are becoming increasingly competitive. So let's find out if you're putting your money into them. So by show of hands here, how many people have mindfully bought something locally over the last month, let's say? Okay, everyone's done. That's okay. So I know that all of you by law have to have superannuation funds. So by show of hands, how many of you put at least 1% of your superannuation funds in local small business? Okay, one person. Now, there's a lot of things that I could say about this problem, but let's just call it a capital market failure. If you folks, who are the most dedicated advocates of local small business in this region, are systematically over-investing in your competition and under-investing in yourselves, something is very wrong with this picture. I would suggest that what's very wrong is that we're operating under securities laws that were enacted in Australia and the United States and elsewhere in the world during the Great Depression. And these securities laws created a system that we might call investment apartheid. If you're this guy, the accredited investor, the wealthiest 1% of society, you are allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked. If you're in the other 99%, you may only put $1 in a locally owned business if attorneys have created for you disclosure documents. And these disclosure documents could easily cost you $25,000, $50,000, $100,000. And these disclosure documents are often, 100, 200 pages long, 8-point font, all caps. No human being has ever been observed to read these things. These are disclosures that live on lawyers' hard drives, and they're sort of this empty ritual that we have to go through to permit unaccredited investors to put money in local small business. We got to fix that. If we were to fix this, it would mean that about $1 trillion that now is in publicly traded companies in Australia would transfer into local small business. Now that $1 trillion works out to somewhat more than $50,000 per person, so you can do the math about what this would mean in new capital coming into small businesses in this community. How might we do this? How might we make these kinds of changes? Well, I want to run through a list of 10 tools that are becoming increasingly common in the United States, and I've seen a number of analogs for in Australia that might be able to tap the wealth of the 99% and put that into local small business. So number one is credit unions. Credit unions and small banks. We know that credit unions and small banks are much, much more likely to reinvest money that is put on deposit in them in local business. But here's another thing. We know that even in local banks and credit unions, bankers are very conservative animals. They have to be by law. So some people have approached their local bank and credit union and said, you know what, we want you to do more lending to local business. And we will work with you to create special certificates of deposit, CDs, the proceeds of which are used exclusively to support local business. So this picture here comes from a fair trade coffee company in the United States called Equal Exchange. They approached their local bank, Wainwright, in Boston, and asked them to create a special certificate of deposit for customers of Wainwright that wanted to support fair trade coffee. Now, the customers are all unaccredited. They're allowed to put money on deposit. They know their money is at risk, but the loan is overseen by the bank. Thanks to this little innovation, Equal Exchange has a $1 million line of credit. Imagine setting up a kind of certificate of deposit to support local businesses here in the Central Highlands. Number two, co-ops. Co-ops are an institutional form that people have been using to invest locally for many years. One reason is that a co-op membership is not regarded as a security. Now, when a co-op takes a loan from its members, that is a security, but co-ops have a kind of universal principle that they share things with other co-ops. So when one co-op invests in disclosure documents for a loan, they are very eager to share those documents with other co-ops who just sort of, like the lawyers, just change the names and voila, you have the instant disclosure documents. So here's an example. Weaver Street Market is a consumer co-op, grocery co-op in Research Triangle in North Carolina. They have 13,000 members. They needed $1 million to build a third store, and they borrowed up that money from their members, paying the members 6, 7, 8% per year for the privilege of using their capital. Number three, LION. LION stands for the Local Investment Opportunities Network of Port Townsend, Washington. Port Townsend is a town of about 10,000 people, 2 hours drive north of Seattle. It was started by this guy, James Fraser. Fraser was a successful hedge fund operator in New York, got very wealthy, felt a little bad how he made all his money, came back to his hometown and wanted to address one particularly annoying part of securities law. And this is true as much in Australia as in the United States. Even if you've spent $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 to do the disclosure work so that unaccredited investors can put money in your business, you still may only be able to approach people with whom you have a pre-existing relationship, that is friends or family. You cannot advertise generally. Well, James had a great idea. He said, I'm going to hold a party in Port Townsend once a month. I'm going to invite businesses, I'm going to invite investors, and at the end of each party I'm going to have a sign-up list. And the sign-up list is going to indicate with whom do you now have a pre-existing relationship. And so when he gets a business plan, he then has a legally sound list of who he can circulate that business plan with. Now, I should tell you that just this one little social innovation in Port Townsend since 2008, 10,000 people in the town, has led to $1 million per year of new investment going into local small business. Number 4, sponsorship sites. So in the United States, but frankly all around the world, we're seeing a proliferation of sites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo. There's probably 500 of these sites in the United States. And they're all about people contributing money to businesses. So this offering here is for the Brickside Brewery, Copper Harbor, Michigan's first microbrewery. If you give them $1, you get a thank you note. If you give them $25, you get a t-shirt. If you give them $1,000, maybe you will get a beer named after you. The thank you note, the t-shirt, and the beer name, as far as securities regulators are concerned, are not returns on your investment. So this is a total dodge of securities laws. Now you're thinking, what individual in their right mind would give money to a business for a t-shirt? And the answer last year for Kickstarter was about $300 million worth of people. So some of the businesses here may think about putting themselves on sites like these and then mobilizing people in the community to just donate small amounts of money to provide you capital for critical needs you have as a business. Here's another model, peer-to-peer lending. Kiva.org, which is also spreading around the world, is the equivalent of the Grameen Bank in virtual form. So the Grameen Bank is what won Muhammad Yunus the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years back. And the basic idea is you can lend $100 to a micro-entrepreneur in, say, Bolivia. That micro-entrepreneur just pays you back $100. You don't get any interest. Because you're not getting interest, this also is not a security. So another really smart dodge of securities laws. So Kiva may be increasingly available in Australia so that people can do interest-free loans to businesses. But sooner or later, you'll start getting animals like Prosper and the Lending Club that we have in the United States that allow unaccredited investors to lend money to businesses. And the reason you can do that is that Prosper and the Lending Club have filed millions of dollars of securities filings to make this all legal. Number 6, pre-selling. In Australia and in the United States, many acts of pre-sales are not regarded as securities. So this is a picture of the Awaken Cafe in Oakland, California. They needed $100,000 to move to a new location. They did not want to waste $100,000 on attorney's fees. So they decided to pre-sell coffee. And the basic deal was this. Put down $1,000 today, and when we open up the new shop, you'll get $1,200 worth of coffee, a 20% rate of return. This was how they financed the move. It was absolutely brilliant. And they didn't need to do a whole securities filing around that. Now we get into more interesting and complicated stuff, local stock. And it is possible in the United States and Australia to spend the money on the disclosure documents so that some number of unaccredited investors can put money into your business. This picture here is of a town in Iowa, a small town called Mount Ayr. 15 years ago, a guy wanted to start a grocery store. He created a stock issue that required you had to be a resident of Iowa to buy the stock. He sold the stock like Girl Scout cookies, door to door, and got 350 people to buy the stock. And that's how the grocery store got capitalized. This grocery store has been enormously successful. They've paid a dividend of 5% per year over the last 15 years. They've tripled in size. And we can find other examples of small stock offerings in Australia in places like ASOP. This is the Small Offerings Board of Australia, started by this guy, Paul Niederer. And You know, if you wanted to spend maybe $10,000, $15,000, you could take your company public in a limited way and have as many as 20, could be as high as 50, I forget exactly, unaccredited investors put money into the company. Now I have to say that I regard these small stock options that are available in the United States and Australia as too expensive and too limited. And that's why I started working several years ago with a bunch of other people in the United States. And it was a weird political coalition of local foodies and Tea Party Republicans that came together to basically redefine US securities laws. And we created a new exemption for crowdfunding that allows, you know, hundreds of unaccredited investors to come in and put in as much as $2,000 per person per year with very little legal rigmarole. The cost, I think, we don't know for sure because we're still waiting for our securities regulators to implement the law, but the cost will probably be about $5,000 or $10,000 per company. And I think that gets to a much more affordable level. This is President Obama signing the so-called Jobs Act in April of 2012. And I think there's a need for a similar push toward crowdfunding reform in Australia. Now, I should say that the Government Securities Office put out a paper, a white paper in September, maybe it was August here, on some crowdfunding options. It's really one of the most boring pieces of reading you'll ever do. But it shows that the government is beginning to think about it, and I think if the grassroots really starts to demand some of these changes, there will be a dramatic opening of new opportunities for small business to issue small stock. Once this starts happening, people are going to want places to buy and sell the stock. I spend about 10 hours a week these days working for something called Mission Markets based in New York. Mission Markets is all about creating local stock markets. So these are legally permitted portals where small businesses and small investors can come together in a community and we create a slow-moving marketplace, that is, liquidity for local securities. Once that starts happening, I think the next level is, can we create local diversified pools of capital, local investment funds? And here the news is not good. The news is that in both the United States and Australia, we have even more demanding laws, securities laws governing investment companies than we do with stock issuance. So for example, in the United States, we have 7,500 mutual funds, and not a single one invests in local small business. Not because it's illegal, but no one has been interested in doing it. So what we've had to do is we look for exemptions in the law, places where you can kind of sort of put together an investment fund and you're not designated as an investment fund. It's not as legally demanding. So in the United States, if you're a nonprofit creating community development activities, like many of you are part of here, that is not an investment fund. This guy, Steve Fireman, runs 13 revolving loan funds in Columbus, Ohio, and the 13th fund, because of conversations with Ohio regulators, is open to unaccredited investors. In the meantime, while we're waiting for a new generation of local investment funds to get started, there is a secret weapon that we have in the United States and you have. And so secret that a dummies book has been written about it. And that is the self-directed super fund. You can use your tax-deferred superannuation dollars, which are only investable in globalized mutual funds right now. And you can put that in the hands for a small fee of a custodian. And that custodian has to follow your directions to put the money in anything you want the custodian to put the money into. You can put your money into everything we just talked about. You could put your tax-deferred superannuation into targeted CDs from a local credit union. You could put it into a co-op as a loan. You could put it into small stock issued on ESOP. You could put it into a local investment fund. You could put it in a peer-to-peer lending platform. The only thing you cannot do with your self-directed super fund is invest in your own house or your kid's house. But interestingly, you can invest in your neighbor's house. And your neighbor can take her superannuation fund and invest in your house. And therein lies an interesting concept for next year to discuss. Where I want to leave you, and where I leave the Local Dollars, Local Cents book, is with a children's tale called A Blue So Blue by Jean-Francois Dumont. Because I think this children's tale embodies a really important gem of wisdom that we forget in our investment and economic development behavior. The story is about a boy who is obsessed with the color blue. Everywhere he goes, he loves to paint the color blue. But there's one shade of blue that mesmerizes him, comes to him in his dreams, and he just can't figure out where that blue has come from. So he decides that he is going to set out on an international journey to find that shade of blue. He goes to the Louvre, looks at the paintings of the masters, can't find the blue there. He goes onto an ocean line, looking for patches of blue around the world, in the water, can't find it there. Goes to a blues bar in New Orleans, nope, doesn't find it there. And then he sees a blue-hooded stranger in the desert. And he asks this stranger where he might find this blue, and the stranger says, what you've been looking for may never have been very far away. The boy thinks about it and then realizes that that blue he had just journeyed tens of thousands of miles to find, that he went all over the place to look for, was actually the blue in his mother's eyes. And I think that is an important reminder to us that sometimes the wealth we go far outside of our homes to look for is right here. And you've got this wealth. You are in the middle of a surplus boom time. I mean, yes, there are ups and downs week by week, month by month, but in the greater scheme of things, you have got a flow of wealth going through this community. And if you use this wealth really wisely to invest in diversifying your local business network and creating self-reliance through more locally owned business entities, I think you will have bought yourself a very prosperous future. I am open for questions. Thank you. And I just want to be clear that I use food examples because, in a way, food is where there's been the richest amount of innovation around local investment. It doesn't have to be that way, but it just so happens that that's where it's been.
Let's not forget.
Yeah. Who else? And comments are fine too. Yeah, so local dollars, local cents is really, it's partially about the latest data in economic development on why you would embrace this philosophy. I begin the book by talking about the pathetic performance of publicly traded companies, and that actually, despite all the hype around Wall Street, when you look, when you use the data of an American economist who actually just this week won the Nobel Prize in economics, Robert Shiller, you find that the typical return of Wall Street in any 12-month period has been 2.6%. And that's about the kind of return that we see on Australian and European markets as well. And at that level, a lot of local businesses can do pretty well. And then I kind of go through co-ops, banking, small stock, investment funds, and then talk about strategies of investing in yourself. So there's, whereas today I went over maybe 10 examples, the book has about 40 case studies in it. Yeah, and I think it is worthwhile to, you probably would find some interesting small examples of local investing if one dug a little below the surface here, and that's I think worth a start. Who has issued small stock? What kinds of innovations have credit unions in Queensland engaged in? What are some of the edges that would allow us to create pools of money, say revolving loan funds, maybe in nonprofits?
Do you have a sense of work in Australia of a movement using these principles in Australia? I know we have our own development corporation here, the Queensland Chamber of Commerce, they stuff around some business, red tape and much of that stuff. But is there a conscious movement or a conscious setup of excellence, if you like, pushing this down, or is it just desperate people just trying to be their own little bit?
Yeah, I would say it's inchoate and coming together, and I would say it's much more than that in the United States. There's a guy in the United States named Woody Tash who wrote a book called Slow Money, inspired by the principles of slow food. And slow money, I mean, this book kind of met a calling of a lot of people who are thinking about how can I put more of my money into local food and local agriculture. And so we now have networks of slow food practitioners around the United States. And in a way, they have become one of the leaders. And Woody has been to Australia a couple of times, and there are some slow food networks that are emerging here. I would say similar groupings, although they're not focused just on local investment, transition towns. Some of those folks have a great interest in this. Let's point to the areas of Australia where actually I think you're ahead of the United States. So credit unions and banking. I think you have had a much tighter regulatory environment that has limited the growth of mega banks and limited some of their outrageous behavior in the United States. And I think there is then a healthier banking sector that has more community orientation. And you have something like Bendigo, which, while it is a publicly traded bank, has these just add water local nodes that I think are really helpful for getting communities involved in all of this. ASOB, there really was nothing like ASOB in the United States until we passed our crowdfunding act. So I think ASOB itself and the people who participate in that are kind of leaders in this movement as well.
There's no sense of excellence in any universities that you're aware of where there are,
There probably,
economists, regional economists who are...
yeah, there probably are, and I am, I just spoke last week to the Cyber Conference, keynoted there, and there were some academics from around the country who, have put a little bit of time into thinking about this. I think the problem is that we tend to create ghettos around community investment. We say, oh, well, we're going to build a bunch of nonprofits to support community. Or we're going to, work with some small community-based credit unions and try to get more lending into businesses. All those things are important. But in my mind, the big picture is securities. The big picture is your superannuation funds. And how we get that money into the 3/4 of your economy that is small, local, and competitive is the big challenge. And I don't see a lot of people working on that yet.
Just a question on that. Rachel from GT poses a lovely idea of the self-managed fund, we must super into it, part where I'm doing a blockage is to work out what is my next best entity for that super fund to invest into, so GT poses can suck that and run a business. Is that the circle you were kind of trying to refer to earlier?
Yes.
I'm stuck in between the super fund and what's a good entity.
Right.
Moving back out.
Exactly, and this is a universal problem because we're trying to simultaneously create, 4 or 5 different institutions. Again, we want to make it easier for small businesses to issue securities. We want to make it easier for people to trade those securities on stock markets. We want to create diversified funds for people to put money in pools into those companies so that you're not so at risk. And we want to then help bigger pools of money like pension funds put money into those smaller investment funds. So right now we're at the very beginning place. We're just really focused on creating the securities. So it's going to take some time for the rest to happen. My recommendation is, if you see a bunch of local businesses that are looking for money here, maybe put 10% of your superannuation fund under self-direction and, see if you can creatively put some of that money to work in that. As policymakers, I think one of the things that might be done here is just create a list, an informal list of every company in this region that's looking for money. And then I would go out there and try to identify who would be willing to provide superannuation fund services so that we know who will do the self-directed IRAs and create a little bit of a competitive market in there. And I think just those 2 acts of identifying businesses seeking investment and identifying self-directed super people who are willing to put money into those businesses would really get things taken off here. Yeah, so franchises, are kind of this interesting animal, neither fish nor fowl. So in the United States, I was part of a group of people that helped to start a kind of alternative chamber of commerce called BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And we have 80 networks representing 30,000 businesses in the United States. We leave it to each network to define how they want to handle franchises. Personally, I think there's a difference between a franchise like McDonald's, which dictates every single thing you buy and dictates every bit of your marketing and everything that you cook, from another franchise that maybe you're using their name, but you're very creative in how you source stuff and how you market stuff and the kinds of goods you're selling. So I think, in a way, the looser the franchise, the more you're permitted to buy things locally probably the more we should associate that franchise with the virtues of locally owned business.
It might be a little bit too specific, but I'm just wondering, you gave two examples of successful buy local campaigns. Are you able to perhaps explain why the first one was successful rather than in San Francisco, one in
Oh, you mean the two cards, the Portland and
So one of them was
the
one where it was
debit card.
local credit union.
Yeah.
The first one, what was it that made it successful? Because obviously there are lots of buy local campaigns in the world, but what made it successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, shall we say that necessity is the mother of invention, and people can't afford to continue to raise money indefinitely from local government and from philanthropists to run buy local campaigns. So people are really looking for ways of cash flowing this activity. So in the United States, there's probably 20 cards like these, buy local cards, and then there's other things too. There are directories that people put out that cash flow from advertising. There are entities that help to do business-to-business local contracting and then assess finder's fees, and that is a plausible business model. I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation out there, but I would just say the start, what differentiated these people is they said, we want to make a business out of it. And if you really demand out of yourself, this is not going to be charity, this is going to be a business that supports local businesses, then you have a shot at making it work.
Any other final questions?
And this is where you can find me. Feel free to email, tell me great success stories that you find. I hope this community has many of them. And thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And we have put some information on Michael's books on each table, but if you are wanting to have a look at those, then I think there's probably a lot that you can get out of those. And thank you for your presentation. I think I've got a few things that I'm going to take away out of that and probably be creative about the local invest local and local buyers, probably one of the big ones. But also looking at diversification and exploring the opportunities we have and thinking outside the square. So I think there's some of the ones that we can all work together on that. And I think many of us in this region and business are probably progressing along that way fairly well and working towards the future. So once again, thank you to all of you, and I hope you've enjoyed your lunch, and I hope you've enjoyed and taken something, we'll be able to take something away from what Michael Shuman has presented with us to us today, and thank you for joining us in our region. We're very proud of our region and what we have to offer. And also thank you to Qantas Link for providing the support in bringing them here. So don't rush away, there's still some tea and coffee, and you finish your dessert and have a chance to talk to people and maybe look at where some of those alliance opportunities are as well. And for those of you joining us on Friday night, we look forward to spending time with you then as well. So thank you very much.
It was actually, funnily enough, a lot of what he said is actually really relevant to I don't really have much. I don't know, like Mac, he's been talking for like 30 years.